So today in the shop, I'm going to show you how to make your own crown molding using tools that are commonly available for cheap on Craigslist as well as at garage sales near you. So let's get to it. So let's go over the tools you're going to need to do this. First thing, you're going to need a molding cutting head. Now I'm sure there's ways you could make all of this stuff work with a router and router bits, but that's not how I'm going to do it here. Since I'm making the video, this is how we'll be doing it. These molding cutter heads were sold in great quantities during the 60s, 70s, and 80s by craftsmen. They were also produced by Delta as well as DeWalt, however those ones are a little less common. These are available for cheap or often free, or often get thrown in with other things at garage sales. So what I have here is the Craftsman single cutter molding head. It's the one I'll be using to do most of the cuts and shaping during our project. Also available was the tri-cutter. It typically came with fewer cutter heads, so you had to buy more to go with it. Supposedly it creates a smoother cut. My personal experience is it seems to do just as good a job, or indeed this one seems to do just as good as this one, I should say. I honestly can't tell the difference. Maybe if you went through some really expensive hardwoods, that might be beneficial to have the 3 cutter heads, but I would suggest trying to track down the single cutter head, since you're trying to do this on the cheap. You're going to be using softer woods anyways. The next piece of kit you'll need to use these, or at least the way I'm going to be using them, is the guard for them. This clamps onto a radial arm saw and keeps you from lopping your fingers off. I'm going to take this moment to tell you that we're all adults, we're all in the shop, and you take responsibility for yourself. If you lop all your fingers off in the course of this video, well, that's on you. I'm not an expert at this, but I clearly play one on YouTube. But just use some common sense, be safe, and if you don't feel comfortable doing something, stop and either get somebody else to do it, or go buy some molding yourself at the hardware store. Moving on. The main piece of equipment I'll be using for this video is going to be the radial arm saw. Now, radial arm saws in recent years have received an unfair share of negative attention. Lots of people that have never used one, or have used one incorrectly, will tell you that they're dangerous and that you're going to cut all your fingers off. And that's just not true. Most of the danger on these saws comes from people not understanding how they work, and largely from using the wrong blades or not setting them up correctly to begin with. There are a number of videos on YouTube that go over how to set these up correctly, as well as how to use them safely. I'm not going to go over all that in this video. There's no point in reinventing the wheel. Ian from the Northland Workshop has a pair of excellent videos that show how to safely make almost every cut you could ever want to make on a radial arm saw, as well as how to set one up from scratch when you get it home. Do not think you can just buy one of these, bring it home, and start cutting wood. That's when they become dangerous. These are available for very cheap because they have such a bad reputation. This Craftsman one I picked up for $50. I had spent a little bit of time tuning it up, cleaning out years worth of grime so that all the rotating and moving parts clamp together correctly, and now it is a wonderful tool. The Delta Rockwell saw behind me over here. Yes, I have 2 radial arm saws. Do you need 2? No, but 2 is better than 1. I bought it for $100, so a little bit more, but it came with the molding cutter head, as well as a number of other guards, tools, blades, and other accessories. So like I said, these are available for very cheap, and you hunt around, you can find good deals. As for what radial arm saw you should buy, do some research online. There are 3 major brands that produce them: the Craftsman, the Delta Rockwell, and then DeWalt, which I don't have here. Most people will say that DeWalt is the best saw, and it very well may be. I don't have one. The older Craftsman that I have, I'm very happy with, and the older, well, as far as I know, all the Delta Rockwell saws are also excellent. I'm very happy with that one as well. But finding one and tuning it up, that is up to you. But you need a well-tuned radial arm saw to carry on with this video. Next up, lumber choice. I have previously used pine with great success. This time around, I'm going to try using this, which is what Home Depot sells as, I believe, laminated whitewood, which, to be honest, to me, looks a heck of a lot like pine. I'm sure it's just some junk wood that they've, well, I know it's just some junk wood that they've cut, glued and laminated together, plain, smooth, and filled. But since most trim is going to be painted anyways, I didn't see the reason to buy anything expensive. And indeed, if you buy something expensive, suddenly making your own molding doesn't make as much sense. So, dollar value is important, as I mentioned, because you can buy this for about $5 a foot, roughly, at Home Depot near me. Now, this whitewood is $20 for the 12 by 8 plank. That of course works out to about $2.50 a linear foot. I can get 2 strips out of this, which halves it again. So I'm about $1.25 a foot versus $5 if I make it myself. And make it yourself is just more fun, let's be honest, that's why we're here. Otherwise we'd all just go buy it, it's much easier. Not that this is terribly difficult, but it does take a little bit of time. I think the soft woods are a little easier to work with. The cutter head seems to have an easier time going through them, but we'll cross that bridge later. This being 12 inches wide is more than I need. I am aiming for something similar to this one that I made previously. As you can see, it is about 5 1/4 inches tall, but of course you can make it in any dimension and any pattern you like. This is going to be the one that I am going to replicate, as I want it to be the same all around my room. So the first thing we're going to do is rip our planks down to width. I've elected to copy the width of the molding in the rest of my house, which I'll be roughly trying to copy. It's, I believe, 4 1/4 inches wide. Yeah, 4 1/4. So I'll be ripping my 12-inch planks into 3 strips, 2 at 4 1/4, and then the remainder I'll be using to build up the wood into the pieces that fit at the top and the bottom here. Because what we'll have to do is we'll have our base piece, and then we're going to glue on a couple strips to make up the thickness. But first things first, we have to rip it down. Now you could of course use a table saw for this if you have one set up. My workspace is quite small, and setting up my table saw is quite cumbersome if it's something I don't need to do. In this case, it's a fairly large plank. I'm just going to rip it with my radial arm saw. Do whatever works for you. So you can see here, we've cut our 4 1/2 inch thick strip, and then I ripped the remainder down to these 2 strips here. Next we'll be gluing them on to the base piece here. It's important you just use glue and clamps for this, because we're of course going to be milling this away. So if you were to put brad nails or something in it, you'd be hitting them with your tooling. So the piece that we're copying, if we place it up against here, you can see that width-wise, the strips I've made are slightly wider than this piece and slightly wider than this strip. That's just to give us a little bit of room for our cutter head to work. It's always easier to mill a little bit more away. You obviously can't add. Shouldn't be a problem. So I'm just going to glue and clamp this on, and that'll get our molding blank ready to go. It's amazing how often the correct number of clamps is all of them. We'll let that side dry for an hour or two, and then we'll clamp the other side, and then we'll get down to milling it all up. So with our blank all glued up, we're going to start with our cutting. I'm going to start with the smaller piece of our molding here, this smaller beveled edge. Now, these come with instructions. They come with this little book which explains how they all go together and how to use them. This is still available for download online. I would suggest downloading it and reading it. Because, as you can likely guess, while there's no danger in using this correctly, I have no doubt that if you use it incorrectly, you could get hurt very quickly. Now in this case I am using the triple headed cutter, simply because I have it. There's no reason why you couldn't use the single. Like I said, it works just fine, especially for softer woods. Probably works fine for harder woods too, I just haven't used it for that yet, so I can't speak for sure. You can see on mine, just as a reminder to myself, I've put arrows on it to remind me of the direction of rotation. Now, you do want the flat side of the cutter knife. There are two sides. You see a beveled side and a flat side. You want the flat side to be in the direction of rotation on both cutter heads, whether it be the triple blade one or the single one we'll be using later. Now that we have our cutter head assembled, we'll install it on the saw, which is of course unplugged, and again, exercise an abundance of caution while doing anything with these saws. Not because they're massively dangerous, but there's no guards anywhere on them, so if you screw up, it's gonna hurt. So to mount this cutter head to my saw, in my case, I use an extra piece. This is the spacer washer that comes with the single cutter, which we'll be using later. I prefer to use this as my first spacer. I find that the two beveled washers that normally affix the blade to this saw, for some reason on the triple-headed cutter, they don't sit quite right and interfere slightly, and I don't care for that. This is somewhere where you don't want to skimp or jerry-rig something together. You want to be absolutely certain that this is fitting the way you want it to. So once I have that spacer on there, I get the cutter and the bushing that it requires to fit the blade, to fit the arbor on my saw, and then it goes on. And then the special concave spacer washer from this goes on next, and then the nut threads on afterwards. Just like that. Now at this point, I'm going to stress yet again, read the manual, do some reading online about shaping. Do not skimp here. If for some reason you're missing a bushing, or something that yours came with doesn't fit right, or you're unsure about how this should all go together, ask someone that knows. Go into the forums and ask. The Delphi Radial arm saw forums are a wealth of knowledge if you're curious or unsure. This is not somewhere where if you're uncertain or don't have quite the right setup, you just want to forge ahead. Again, Your safety during this sort of procedure is on you. If you're not sure you're safe, don't continue. Now the next step, now that I've fitted the cutter head, is when I'm shaping or doing this sort of operation, I like to use a shorter rear fence. It gives me a little more room for this whole arrangement to sit flatter to the table and for the guard to fit. So we'll pop that on next. Okay, shorter fence on. We can now proceed to line everything up for our first cut. Now, before I set all of this up in the correct orientation on the saw, I want to take a moment just to explain how I'm going to do it while it's all out in the open and easy to see. So as I mentioned before, we're only going to be using the middle lobe and then well, either the left or the right lobe depending on what the orientation is on the saw. In this case, for this demonstration, it's going to be the middle lobe and the left lobe. So you'll see when I put this piece of molding here how it lines up with those two, and then the point on this right edge lines up with the flat face on the back of the molding. So when I put this, or when I set this up in the machine, what I'll be doing is setting this cutter head up so that point lines up flush with the back of our blank. That way I know that this piece will be in the correct dimension. So before I put the guard on with the blank in the correct orientation up against the fence and the saw pivoted around, I wanted to once again reiterate how I'm lining this up. You can see that I have the point lined up with the outer edge of our blank. That way as it goes down, it won't cut away anything on our flat bottom face. Whereas as we move the cutter head down on each consecutive pass, this profile, which is the left 2/3 of the cutter head, will cut its way into this part of the blank. It's at this point I should mention that we're going to do this in a couple passes. We're not going to just set this down to the correct height or our finish height and push it through. These are quite aggressive and can take a lot of wood off, and as such no doubt could easily throw things or get out of control easily. I suggest taking off, well, it depends on the cutter head and how deep you're going, but I like to take a few passes. So the first pass I'll probably have it slightly higher than it is now, just so I'm taking off this outer edge, and then we'll slowly progress and go further and further down until we get to our desired profile. So I now have the saw set up and more or less ready to go. You can see our blank is here and ready to be fed into the saw. You can see I have the guard on the saw. Using a guard is extremely important. Also important is to, once you have the guard on the saw, to rotate the cutter head. In this case I can do it from this side of my motor, just to make sure that the cutter head clears the guard. On some saws, such as my Rockwell over there, I have to use a different guard because it wasn't clear the stock one, which is unfortunate if you don't realize that before you turn it on. You can also see that I have correctly set this guard so that the front leading edge of it just barely clears the wood being fed in to prevent lift. And you can also see that I've set the anti-kickback pawls so that when the board is fed through, they just catch them and prevent the wood from being ejected. Both of these are things that you should know and understand how to do before you do this. So again, learn how to use your tool before you go ahead and find more complex things to do with it. I've also got this high-tech dust collection device, in this case a cardboard box set up, because these things really do throw chips. and make a hell of a mess. So in this case, I'll be using my dust collector and this hood here to hopefully mitigate some of that. Now lastly, what you can also see that I've added here are some boards to keep our blank pushed up against the saw's fence. In this case, I have my long thin springboard here and what I'll call the keeper, so that as my blank approaches the saw, you can see it deflects and keeps it pushed up against the fence. Likewise, I have one on this side of the saw, so that as the blank comes through, this piece here also keeps our blank pushed up against the fence. This way, with it square on both sides of the saw, it won't move fore and aft and cause a wave in our profile. Ideally, I would also have a piece somehow constructed to keep this pushed down against the table of the saw, because I have found in the past that if I have a board that has a bit of a bow in it, what will happen is you'll get one spot where the profile will dig a little bit deeper. This one's fairly straight, so I'm not too concerned, but it's something you should be aware of. So without further ado, let's run our first pass. So here we are after our first pass. You can see that it's already taking shape and looks reasonable. You can see we have our flat backside, which is what we wanted, and we have our double beaded profile. However, as you can see, we still have this large step here, which wasn't present in the one that we're trying to copy. So what I'm going to do is drop this down another 1/16 of an inch or so, and we're going to make another pass, and I'll bring this down another 1/16 of an inch. And I'm going to continue making passes until this comes all the way down and stops right at our piece of, right at the base piece of our blank, so that we get the same profile as the one I'm trying to copy. This is a reminder for what we're aiming for. Once again, this is the one that we're copying. You can see that the double bead transitions perfectly into the base and doesn't have a step here. You could of course leave that if that's the look you're going for, but I want it to be a clean transition from the base or directly up into what I'm calling the double bead. A small note of particular importance. This is of course true with all cuts made on a radial arm saw, but before making the second pass, you want to clean all of this away from the fence and the table surface. If there's a small, even a single chip sitting here against the fence, it will space it out, and your second pass will move over in reference to your first one, and you won't get a clean shape to the profile. What I like to do, so that I know how much I'm taking off with each consecutive pass, is I just take my tape measure, line it up with a straight edged line, such as the edge of this bracket or the bolt, and that way as I lower it, I can see exactly how much more I'm taking off. So in this case, I'm going to take off about a little over, maybe 3/32 to 1/8 of an inch, somewhere in there. This wood's quite soft, it cut quite nicely. Now of course when you lower it, you also have to remember that you need to readjust your front guard as well as the anti-kickback pawl on the other side of the saw. So after several passes, as I crept up on it, you can see here, I have exactly what we were aiming for. The double bead that's right into my base of the blank, with no step, with a flat edge on the back. Now, what the camera may or may not pick up on is you can see almost what looks like a little line running down the inside of the blank here. That's just a little bit of a lip because my board isn't quite flat, so the cutter dug in just a little bit here, and then on the far end it actually left just a little bit of wood. This is nothing that a quick once over with a chisel and a bit of sanding won't take care of. It's really no issue. I'm sure if you planed all of your stock and jointed it all and got it all perfectly square before you started, this would be less of an issue. But for what we're doing, a little bit of sanding and a little bit of just running a chisel right along it here, and it won't be an issue at all. For the next part of our molding edge, which will be this upper portion we'll be forming next, we'll be using all this cutter head, or part of it again. You'll see that we really only use parts of cutter heads, and I'm going to be using it like this to form this upper straight lip and the first bead. So I'm going to measure how wide I want this top square portion to be, mark it on my blank, and then of course line this outer edge or the point of it up with that, so that when it comes down it makes the correct shape. A little trick I'll mention to get this all lined up a little bit easier is if you mark out the depth of your first step, which is this line here, as well as the width of your top section that's not going to be shaped, it's much easier to line the edge of your cutter blade up with this piece here, and then you'll just slowly creep down until you hit your pencil line. So you've probably figured out how the rest of this is going to work by now, but this is our last cutter. We'll be using, of course, not the entire thing, but part of it, to form this last bit of the profile. To get the right location for it, I'm going to measure over from this edge to the edge here of our molding, which is where I'm going to place the point of my cutter, so that when it comes down and touches the base of the molding, it will be in exactly the correct spot. As I carry along with my last few passes to bring this down to where I want to, you'll see I have this leftover lip here. This is going to start interfering with the blade guard on my saw, so I'm just going to run a chisel or a sharp knife along here and take it off all the way down so that it's no longer in my way. So I've now finished my last passes with the molding head, and I've taken a chisel and run it over the piece of molding to take off any little burrs of wood that were left. I also ran a flat cutter head just over the last little section here on the flat to take away any of the wood that was left that the molding cutter didn't take away. So, our final profile, as you can see, turned out very, very nicely. And if I can get the camera to line it up, you can see that they are virtually identical. The only difference, of course, being that this one has been relieved around the corner. That's just done with a miter saw and a 45 and gluing a piece back in. but the profile of each one is virtually identical. My one final suggestion in all of this is that if you have an entire room that you're planning to do, make all your blanks to start with and run them all through one after the other. While not impossible, it is very difficult, or I should say very time-consuming, to make exact matches to your previous work. From room to room, it's less of an issue because you can get it extremely close, and since you can't be in 2 rooms at once, you'll never know the difference. But to get them close enough to meet up and be the same profile within a room, that in itself is quite difficult. At least quite difficult to get perfect. Can be done. So there you have it. That's, in a nutshell, how to make your own crown molding for half the price of what you pay in the store, using equipment that you can buy on Craigslist and on Marketplace for less than $100. So get out there and do it. And as an added bonus, here's what the trim looks like when it's been painted, mitered, and put up around the window. So you can see it's relieved around the corners, all the way along. And I also made these side pieces of molding. Those were quite basic compared to the crown molding. They were just a quadruple bead put into it. But once it's all up there and put up, it is indistinguishable from any store-bought molding you might find.